Hey guys, I've been playing a lot of Magic the Gathering recently, and I have a really cool standard deck tech for you guys. And if you've ever wanted to play a fun standard red-blue deck that doesn't cost hundreds of dollars and doesn't run the expensive red-blue finisher called Torrential Gearhulk, then you've come to the right place. I've got a relatively cheap blue-red Cryptic Serpent deck tech for you guys, with some budget alternatives if you guys want that too. Outside of that, it's also pretty rotation proof. It only runs a few cards that are going to rotate this year, of which many are commons. So it's a pretty safe deck to invest in. With all this in mind, let's get started. Naturally, we will run a playset of Cryptic Serpent. The deck is named after the card after all, and it's a great card if you build your deck around it. If you do, the payoff of a 2-mana 6/5 that dodges Fatal Push and Grasp of Darkness, that's pretty good. So this deck is going to try its hardest to use and dump instants and sorceries into the graveyard to get this 2-mana 6/5 online as fast as possible. Aside from the Cryptic Serpent, we are also going to run 3 copies of Bedlam Reveler, another card that costs less for having instants and sorceries in your graveyard. The Reveler can also give you a hand refill if you have an empty hand, which is sweet, and it's also a 3/4 prowess creature, which is also a pretty great thing too. We're only running 3 because we don't want to have multiples of Bedlam Reveler in our hand, as one will discard the other. Reveler is great, but just try not to discard your other important creature cards with it. Other than these big creatures, we've got a couple of early game cards too. First off is 2 copies of Baral, Chief of Compliances, which is great at making our many instants a bit cheaper. Aside from that, Baral can help us loot whenever we counter something, helping us get to our threats early and get instants into our graveyard, and also helping us dig through our deck to the cards we want. And finally, we've got our big hitter, 4 copies of Enigma Drake. Enigma Drake can very easily be a 7 to 8 power flying attacker with the rate that this deck likes to dump instants and sorceries. It's a great finisher for our deck. I've actually gotten Enigma Drake up to 10 to 12 attack before in fact, and an unchecked Enigma Drake can be used to close out a game very quickly. And now that we have our creature base, let's figure out what instants and sorceries we are going to run, not only to stall out the game, but also to dump our spells into the graveyard. Almond Kit gave us a lot of good cycling instants that we can use not only to draw a card, but also to get an instant into the graveyard. And remember, you can cycle at instant speed, so you can set up a counterspell or a removal spell for your opponent's turn, and if you don't need it, then you can cycle at the end of their turn. Pretty handy. With this in mind, we're going to run 4 copies of Hieroglyphic Illuminations and 4 copies of Censor. Hieroglyphic Illuminations may seem like a poor man's glimmer of genius, but we're actually going to use the cycling part of this card more often than the actual card itself. And in the late game, when you have enough mana, you can use it to draw 2 cards, so it's not bad and very flexible actually. And Censor is just great. Fantastic counterspell in the early game, and when you don't need to counter anything, or when your opponent has enough mana to make the counterspell null and void, you can just cycle it away for a hopefully more useful card. Aside from Censor, we are also going to run a couple of other counterspells too. We are going to run 3 copies of Negate, which is really great in this meta. It not only guards our creatures against removal, but it is also really good against planeswalkers and other things too. It's very versatile. Other than Negate, we're also going to run 2 copies of Essence Scatter to counter all the creatures in the meta. And this is a very creature-heavy meta we are in, so Essence Scatter is a great counterspell to use. And the final counterspell we're going to run is 3 copies of Disallow, which is currently the best counterspell in the format, hitting not only spells, but many important abilities too. If you want a good budget alternative, since Disallow is kind of pricey, I would recommend Spell Shrivel. It's a cheap alternative to cards like Disallow and Void Shatter, has an easier color requirement, and exiles the cards too, which in a zombie-filled meta can be very, very helpful. Now that we've gone over our counter spells, let's go over our removal sweep. At the very bottom, we've got 2 copies of Magma Spray, which is a great tool against many decks. The exile effect is fantastic against Scrap Heap Scrounger, against zombie decks, and against Delirium decks. It's a very integral card to battle against these various decks and cards you'll see in the meta. Aside from that, we are also going to run 2 copies of Harness Lightning, because, well, it's one of the best removal cards in the meta. And it synergizes with our Aether Hubs, which, by the way, we are also running. Finally, to finish up, we're going to run 2 copies of Catalog. We're running Catalog opposed to Tormenting Voice, specifically for the instant speed. There will be many times where we want to hold up a counterspell for our opponent instead of casting Catalog. And if we don't need the counterspell, Catalog is infinitely better than Tormenting Voice, due to its instant speed. And Catalog is great, as it can put up to 2 instants into the graveyard for our creatures, and let us cycle through our deck quicker to find the cards we need faster. And finally, we'll run 1 copy of Pull from Tomorrow, as a hand refill if the game goes on for too long. It's not as good as Catalog in the early game, but in the late game it's great, and the instant speed is a huge boon too. Although, I will say, if you want a budget alternative, you could just run a 3rd Catalog. And finally, we've got our land base. Since it's a red-blue deck, we're going to run a playset of Spirebluffs and a playset of Wandering Fumarole. It's going to be a bit expensive to use the red-blue duels, so if there's anywhere to try to find a budget alternative, it's with these dual lands. Just replace them with basics, I guess. Other than that, we're also going to run 3 copies of Aether Hub, as stated, to synergize with the Harness Lightning, and lastly, we've got ourselves 8 islands and 5 mountains. So we're only running 24 lands, which is much fewer than the regular red-blue decks run, but since we've got so much cycling in the deck, we are fine with running so few lands. And plus, we ideally don't want to be spending more than 3 mana to cast anything, so 24 lands is fine. And now, let's go over the sideboard. We are going to fill out the playset of many cards in the main, including Magma Spray, Harness Lightning, Essence Scatter, Negate, and Disallow. For new cards, we're going to run 2 copies of Sweltering Suns, as a board clear against aggressive decks. We're going to run 2 copies of Warfire Javilineer to remove creatures Harness Lightning can't quite take out, and we're going to run 2 copies of Overwhelming Denial, as budget counterspells against control. They're great because they can't be countered, which is perfect against control decks. And finally, we're going to run a 1-of Dispel, as a kind of makeshift 5th negate, in order to help protect our creatures, or counter other counterspells. And there's the deck. I've actually had a lot of fun building and also playing this deck, so I hope you guys try it out. This has been my very first deck tech I've done, so comment below how you think it is and what you guys would have done to make it better. I appreciate all the constructive criticism I can get. Thanks for watching, and see you guys later.